Hey there everybody, my name is Eric. I'm sure many of you are aware of the now classic Rockstar Team Bondi game L.A. Noire. I've recently revisited the post-World War II period drama, and it's still an impressive piece of work. The game was remastered and re-released in 2017 along with a VR version, but I wanted to replay the original, both to see how it holds up and because I'm a cheapskate who didn't want to pony up for yet another version of a game I have on 3 platforms. To my surprise, it holds up rather well. Don't get me wrong, it looks like a 10-year-old game, but the core facial animations are still effective. If you haven't played the game, one of the major mechanics involves determining if a subject being questioned is lying or withholding evidence. You do this by paying close attention to facial cues. Using a technology called motion scan, the actors' faces were scanned using 32 separate cameras to capture even the most minute details of their performance. To the best of my knowledge, no other game has used this technology, which is now primarily used in movies, and certainly no game is focused so heavily on the nuanced facial performances of its characters, which is a shame really. The results are incredible, and often off-putting, sometimes creepy. The game also features a huge and top-notch cast. Unlike Rockstar's other major franchises such as Grand Theft Auto and the Red Dead series, which are set in a stylized parallel of our own world, L.A. Noire takes place in the real world in 1947 and follows the career of Los Angeles detective Cole Phelps. Real landmarks, people, and events are shown and discussed. And while there is a high level of fictionalization, there is a great deal of truth in the game. Some of the cases are even based on actual police cases of the time. The narrative is an effective story in the noir genre, taking inspiration from several quintessential sources and weaving a dark, tightly structured tale of moral dilemmas and shades of gray. I only have 2 gripes with the story. One is that one of the major plot points revolves around the main character making a huge decision in his personal life, and while we see a lot of his time in the Marines shown in flashbacks, we don't get any insight into his home life and are just expected to accept that he makes this decision with no context. A decision that runs rather counter to how we see him behave in almost every other situation. The other issue I have is that near the end of the game, we're suddenly forced into another character's point of view. While it makes sense in terms of plot, it is rather jarring. These criticisms aside, it's still a great story. But how much of the game is based on real life, and how much is fiction? The first thing we learn about our main character Cole Phelps is that he served in the Marines during World War II, specifically in the Battle of Okinawa. Not only does this play a role in the actual series of events that take place in the game, but the experience is shown to have a profound impact on Cole's development as a person. The Battle of Okinawa was one of, if not the, bloodiest battle in the Pacific Campaign. Not only were the casualties extreme, but the sheer brutality of the engagement was enough to change the course of the entire war. The history of Japan is shaped by its geography as an archipelago, encompassing almost 7,000 islands. The Okinawa Prefecture is a series of islands unofficially annexed by Japan in 1609 and officially incorporated as its own domain in 1879 under the Japanese Empire's Han system. It became important to the Allied forces in World War II who wished to use the main island of the Okinawa chain as a launching point for what they had hoped would be the final assault and invasion of the Japanese home islands. On April 1, 1945, American forces landed on the Kurama Islands just 15 miles west of Okinawa and started the battle, which lasted some 82 days. First-hand descriptions of what took place over those 82 days are harrowing beyond comparison. According to the Okinawa Prefecture Peace Memorial Museum, the Japanese Imperial Army was unbelievably ruthless, not only to the American invading forces, but to the indigenous population as well. The island's native inhabitants, the Riots people, lost almost 150,000 of its citizens, roughly a third of the population. The Japanese army conscripted many indigenous civilians, including as many as 2,000 middle school-aged children to fight for them, and even more children served as medics. They were said to have used civilians as human shields in combat, commandeering food from the population to the point of actual starvation, and executing civilians who withheld food. With the impending Japanese defeat, civilians often committed mass suicide, urged on by the Japanese soldiers who told locals that victorious American soldiers would go on a rampage of killing and raping. Ryukyu Shimpo, one of the two major Okinawan newspapers, wrote in 2007, "There are many Okinawans who have testified that the Japanese army directed them to commit suicide. There are also people who have testified that they were handed grenades by Japanese soldiers to blow themselves up." Thousands of civilians, having been induced by Japanese propaganda to believe that American soldiers were barbarians who committed horrible atrocities, killed their families and themselves to avoid capture at the hands of the Americans. Some of them threw themselves and their family members from the southern cliffs where the Peace Museum now resides. Okinawans were often surprised at the comparatively humane treatment they received from the American enemy. Combat translators struggled to convince many civilians not to kill themselves. Survivors of the mass suicides also blamed the indoctrination of their education system of the time, in which Okinawans were taught to become, quote, more Japanese than the Japanese, unquote, and were expected to prove it. This extreme level of brutality rightfully took its toll on the invading forces. American personnel casualties included thousands of cases of mental breakdown. According to the account of the battle presented in Marine Corps Gazette, more mental health issues arose from the Battle of Okinawa than any other battle in the Pacific during World War II. The constant bombardment from artillery and mortars, coupled with the high casualty rates, led to a great deal of personnel coming down with combat fatigue. Additionally, the rains caused mud that prevented tanks from moving and tracks from pulling out the dead, forcing Marines, who pride themselves on burying their dead in a proper and honorable manner, to leave their comrades where they lay. This, coupled with thousands of bodies, both friend and foe, littering the entire island, created a scent you could nearly taste. Morale was dangerously low by the month of May, and the state of discipline on a moral basis had a new low barometer for acceptable behavior. The ruthless atrocities of the Japanese throughout the war had already brought on an altered behavior deemed so by traditional standards by many Americans, resulting in the desecration of Japanese remains. But the Japanese tactic of using the Okinawan people as human shields brought about a new aspect of terror and torment to the psychological capacity of the Americans. David Hurst of The Guardian reports that he was told by a prefecture official, "You have the Battle of Britain, in which your airmen protected the British people. We had the Battle of Okinawa, in which the exact opposite happened. The Japanese army not only starved the Okinawans, but used them as human shields. That dark history is still present today, and Japan and the US should study it." Atrocities were not confined to the Japanese, of course. Infantryman George Pfeiffer wrote, "There was some return fire from a few of the houses, but the others were probably occupied by civilians, and we didn't care. It was a terrible thing not to distinguish between the enemy and women and children. Americans always had great compassion, especially for children. Now we fired indiscriminately." Specifically mentioned is the engagement for Sugarloaf Hill, the encounter where Cole earns the Silver Star. Sugarloaf was one of 3 hills along the Japanese defensive line that overlooked the open country that led straight to the main line of resistance near Shuri Castle. Though unassuming, the hills offered strategic ground, and it was unlikely the Allies would take Okinawa without them. The problem was that each of the hills could defend the others, and the Japanese were honeycombed throughout the area. All told, it took more than 8 days and 3,000 lives to capture the 230-foot rise. Some military historians believe that the utter inhumanity of the Okinawa campaign led directly to the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki as a means to avoid the planned ground invasion of the Japanese home islands. Historian Victor Davis Hanson wrote in his book Ripples of Battle, "Because the Japanese on Okinawa were so fierce in their defense, even when cut off and without supplies, and because casualties were so appalling, many American strategists looked for an alternative means to subdue mainland Japan other than direct invasion. This means presented itself with the advent of atomic bombs." It's certainly easy to see how these events shaped the lives of those who survived them. Cole's traffic desk partner, Stefan Bukowski, mentions that while Cole was overseas, he earned a citation for bravery in the Zooter riots. And while Bukowski seems like a stand-up guy, I'm not sure that's something I'd brag about. The Zooter, or Zoot Suit riots, were a series of racially charged conflicts that took place between the Mexican-American population of Los Angeles and the military personnel stationed there. In many instances, these violent clashes were unofficially endorsed or even aided by the police. Many factors led up to the riots. Racial tensions were already high as many Mexican refugees emigrated to the area fleeing the revolution of their homeland. Repatriation was also taking place of the 1.2 million Mexican American citizens who were illegally deported immediately following the stock market crash of 1929. Jobs that had once belonged to the men who had gone off to fight in World War II were now being filled by women and minorities, and even though Hispanics were overrepresented in the military, many white servicemen saw this as just another type of invasion. But what does all this have to do with zoot suits? Well, if you've never seen one, it typically included bright-colored fabrics, long coats that often reached the knees, wide, flamboyant shoulders, and ruffled slacks. The arm and ankle areas were often much tighter than the rest of the fabric, giving the whole look a triangular shape. It began with the urban African-American scene in the 1940s. This style of clothing cultivated a sense of racial pride and significance. However, the fashion statement soon made its way into the wardrobes of young Southern California Mexicans and Filipinos, who became the quintessential wearers of the zoot suit. And during the neo-swing movement of the late 1990s, I may have rocked the zoot suit, and I may have looked amazing in it, but that's beside the point. These Zooter youths became known as Pachucos. Outside the scope of this video, Pachuco culture is fascinating. Neither Mexican nor American, and spurned by both, Pachucos created a counterculture all their own, with their own dress, style, and language. The cornerstone of Pachuco culture was resistance to assimilation, which sometimes presented as outright rebellion, an image that Pachuco gangs were only too happy to maintain. And while Pachucos only represented a small fraction of the total Hispanic population, the rebellious image was so strong that it carried over, painting much of the Hispanic population in the same light. During World War II, many regulations were put in place to ration goods and materials, and in March of 1942, the War Production Board regulated the manufacture of men's suits and all clothing that contained wool. To achieve a 26% cutback in the use of fabrics, the board issued regulations for the manufacture of streamlined suits. The regulations effectively forbade the manufacture of wide-cut zoot suits and full women's skirts or dresses. Most legitimate tailoring companies ceased to manufacture suits that fell outside the board's guidelines. While this regulation certainly seems more than sensible, it failed to account for the untold number of zoot suits already in existence, and the level of which the suit itself was part of Pachuco cultural identity. None of that mattered to the average nascent American who saw the flamboyant suits as simply un-American. Soldiers, sailors, and Marines from across the country came to Los Angeles in large numbers waiting to be shipped out to the Pacific Theater. Servicemen and zoot suiters in Los Angeles were both immediately identifiable by their dress. Some servicemen and others in the community felt that the continued wearing of zoot suits represented the youth's public flouting of rationing regulations. Officials began to cast wearing zoot suits in moral terms and associated it with the commission of petty crime, violence, and the snubbing of national wartime rules. After a few minor clashes with each other, the violence finally came to a head when 200 sailors convoyed to East Los Angeles spotted a group of young zoot suiters and assaulted them with clubs. They stripped the boys of the zoot suits and burned the tattered clothes in a pile. They attacked and stripped everyone they came across who was wearing zoot suits. Media coverage of the incidents then started to spread, inducing more people to join in the mayhem. During the next few days, thousands of servicemen and residents joined the attacks, marching abreast down the streets, entering bars and movie houses and assaulting any young Mexican-American males they encountered. In one incident, sailors dragged two zoot suiters on stage as a film was being screened, stripped them in front of the audience, and then urinated on their suits. Although police accompanied the rioters, they had orders not to arrest any, and some of them joined in the rioting. A witness to the attacks, journalist Carrie McWilliams wrote, "Marching through the streets of downtown Los Angeles, a mob of several thousand soldiers, sailors, and civilians proceeded to beat up every zoot suiter they could find. Pushing its way into the important motion picture theaters, the mob ordered the management to turn up the house lights and then ran up and down the aisles, dragging Mexicans out of their seats. Streetcars were halted while Mexicans and some Filipinos and Negroes were jerked from their seats, pushed into the streets, and beaten with a sadistic frenzy. After several days, more than 150 people had been injured. No servicemen were arrested as a result of the beatings. Many Mexican-American youth, however, were arrested after being attacked by the soldiers, more than 500 Latino civilians, on charges ranging from rioting to vagrancy. By this time, the mob was no longer made up of only sailors from the local armory. Soldiers, Marines, and sailors from other installations as far away as Las Vegas eagerly joined in the assaults, with mobs parading through the predominantly African-American sections of Watts and the predominantly Mexican-American East Los Angeles. The local press lauded the attacks, describing them as having a cleansing effect to rid Los Angeles of miscreants and hoodlums. Fearing the negative attention the incidents were creating, the riots were finally stopped when the military stepped in and made LA off-limits, and the Shore Patrol gave orders to arrest disorderly personnel. The fallout from the riots reverberated nationally. Even First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt wrote about them in her column. While it's easy to armchair quarterback from my safe place almost a century later, all in all, I don't know that being a part of that is something I would brag about. Next time, we'll take a look at the true crimes that inspired the cases in the game. Thanks for watching.